video, I'm going to show you guys how to build an awesome $1,200 gaming PC build that offers up exceptional value for money, is powered by one of my favorite 1440p GPUs right now, and uses some great value but really high quality PC components I've never built with before. Let's do this. Supercharge your gaming experience with Zotac RTX 40 series GPUs. Powered by the ultra-efficient Ada Lovelace architecture with support for NVIDIA DLSS 3.5 and of course full ray tracing, what's not to love? Zotac's range features their Ice Storm 2.0 advanced cooling technology and Spectra RGB lighting which you can customize in software. A metal backplate, high build quality and 3+2 year warranty that extends to 5 years total with registration gives you peace of mind now and into the future. Check them out at the first links in the description below. If you've not seen my videos before, the way this is going to work is I'm going to walk you guys through all the parts I chose and why, and assemble the system as I go. I'll then be showing you guys how to wire up this system and make sure it boots a-okay before looking at performance a little bit later. Now talking of performance, this build, really like any gaming PC, is powered by two components, the CPU and GPU. Now it isn't to say that the other parts aren't important, they are, but get these two bits right, especially in a price-conscious build like this one, and you're good to go. Now I'm really excited about the GPU in this build for a couple of key reasons. The 7800 XT has been a favourite of mine since AMD released it. It's more powerful than NVIDIA's RTX 4060 Ti 16GB, is more price competitive, and fills a gap in the market alongside its little brother, the 7700 XT, that has been empty for quite a while. Crucially, you get 16 gigs of VRAM, which is great for 1440p gaming, and you might notice this model is a little bit different. It actually comes in from Acer. Now, up until this point, Acer have only really been a board partner for Intel Arc, and as much as I've liked their efforts when it comes to the A750 and A770, it's clear as day to see that Arc just isn't a great buy right now, and something like this 7800 XT is a much better shout. Build quality feels a little bit plastic, but it's very price competitive as a SKU. You get the standard two 8-pin power connectors, and the backplate feels pretty okay. As I say, it's not the most premium construction GPU I've ever seen, but it's the performance that matters, and that's what I'll be evaluating a little bit later. Oh, and of course the price. I'll link everything for latest pricing and availability down below. I'll be coupling up the 7800 XT with a really fantastic AMD Ryzen processor. This is the Ryzen 5 7600 Non-X. Now there are two derivatives to pick from, the X and the Non-X. The only difference really is a small bump in clock speed and the inclusion of a stock cooler on the lower end model. That's because the higher end chip with its higher power consumption is presumed to be using a third-party aftermarket cooler, something like the Vetru V5 Deepcool AK400 or a unit from Johnsbro. 6 cores and 12 threads make this awesome for gaming now and into the future. The primary advantage though of this CPU is that of course the socket is upgradable right through to the new upcoming Ryzen 9000 CPUs. That means if you wanted one day to pick up, I don't know, a RX 7900 XT and fancy the CPU upgrade too, you can do that on the motherboard in this build. Talking of which, this is the ASRock B650M Pro RS. Now again, this is one of my favourites on the channel here. I've used this a number of different times, and rather interestingly, in Hardware Unboxed recent B650 motherboard guide, which by the way was incredibly comprehensive, they recommended this as being the best board to buy if you're on a budget. I think they actually called this the cheapest motherboard you should consider if you're shopping AM5. Now the reason for that all comes down to power delivery. On some of the cheaper boards on the market, not that this is particularly expensive, you may encounter problems running up to something like a Ryzen 9 or doing any mild overclocking. This with its 8+2+1 design is on the lightweight end of the spectrum and is more affordable as such, but can cope with some of those higher power CPUs. One of my favourite things about AM5, other than its upgradability, is actually this, the top M.2 slot. Pretty much all AM5 boards have a Gen 5 NVMe slot, and I think that is an amazing thing to have. These drives are getting cheaper and cheaper, and in future, when they become the mainstream standard, the inclusion of this slot is particularly useful. A lot of even high-end Z790 boards still don't have it. Again, big points here for AMD. I'm going to go ahead and drop the CPU straight in. This is really, really easy. Just got to find the black triangle on the socket, which is actually up in this corner right here, and match this up with the golden triangle on the CPU. Once you've got those lined up, drop the CPU in carefully because the pins on the motherboard are very fragile. You can give it a little bit of a wiggle just to make sure it's seated correctly. You should feel very little give, then secure the arm back into place. Next up is memory, and to be honest with you, I was hoping to use Team Group Group's T-Force Vulkan memory, but instead have settled on this Delta RGB DDR5. Why? The Vulkan, which is slightly cheaper and ditches the RGB, didn't have the low latency variant in stock at the time of buying the parts for this build. I have ordered a lower latency Vulkan set though, so again I'll link that below as an alternative choice. The main thing with DDR5 is you want 32 gigs in a 2DIMM config, speeds of about 6,000 megahertz, and a cache latency as close to 30 as possible. The closer to 40 you get, the more performance you're going to lose. And in our testing, latency with DDR5 does genuinely make a massive difference. Memory installation is, again, quite simple. Technically, this first slot is slot 0, so we'll be using slots 1 and 3, or the second and fourth slots as you count from the CPU. Then the RAM just slides into place with the T-Force logo facing outwards, bit of pressure to both sides, and clicks in without too many problems. We should be able to control the RGB for this as well in the ASRock motherboard software, nice and simple. Cooling wise, I have opted to stick actually for the stock cooler in this build. More often than not, I'd recommend, as mentioned earlier, Vetru's V5 or a budget tower air cooler from the likes of John's Throat or even Be Quiet. But in this build today, where really getting that 7800 XT in was paramount and cost saving was on my mind, this will be fine. While not absolutely incredible, it is better than Intel stock coolers and doesn't tend to run too loud. So an optional upgrade if you want to spill slightly over the budget, but I wanted to keep it in that $1,200 price point as closely as I possibly could. There is one more part I'm going to install now while doing the motherboard, and that is the SSD. Now this is a really weird one, and I feel like I'm insulting all the parts today. This is Team Group's MP44L, and it advertises read and write speeds of about 5 gigs read, 5 gigs write. However, in our testing, it's like way better than this. Now, we've requested from Team Group another unit just to validate that this is definitely performing as you would expect, but we were seeing in our testing 6 or even 7 gigabytes a second, up there with the top Gen 4 NVMe's for a fraction of the price. Now, I'm going to be using the very top slot. If you're anticipating installing a Gen 5 drive sooner than later, use one of the lower slots, but I like the extra cooling, and as I'm not planning on upgrading this build to a top-end Gen 5 anytime soon, this is going to work well. Teeny tiny screwdriver required for this stage. The standard Phillips head is going to be too big for those M.2 retention screws. With the motherboard assembly now complete and looking, I think, pretty good, it's time to look at the case. Now, this is again really exciting. Never used this before, and it just came up while I was looking through Newegg, some of the options out there. Went ahead and picked it up from Overclockers, and I'll leave those linked down below again for this video. And I have to say, my first impressions are absolutely superb. Price-wise, this is mega competitive. You get a built-in power supply shield, no rubber grommets, which is a hallmark of cheaper cases, but all the metal's folded over. Side panels have got captive thumb screws, and perhaps for me, the more important thing comes down to airflow and cooling, which I'd argue for the price is virtually unmatched. I appreciate that's quite a lofty statement to make, but let me show you. You get a 140mm ARGB in the rear, and a trio of 140mm ARGB fans at the front too. All of these are controlled, I presume, by some sort of RGB controller. Yes, you get this Fantex RGB and SATA controller at the back, all pre-wired in, with a little control buoy for different modes and a SATA power cable. The whole thing build quality wise feels great, and even though it's basic, there's only one room for a hard drive, you still have all of those options crucially included. At the top as well, you've also got a dust filter, so if you did want to have this for some reason in intake mode, I'm not sure why you would, but it's good to have the option most certainly. And for me, 4 included fans is something that in other cases is going to set you back $20, $30, or even $40 after the fact. So massive props to Fantex for that. The only thing in this build where, again, a compromise has been made is I have elected to pick up a micro ATX motherboard. And if you take a look at what that looks like, it is going to mean there's quite a bit of empty space in the case. To be clear, once the GPU and all the power cables in, it's not going to look horrific. The main thing to note though is that all of the standoff locations on this board are going to be slightly different. So still have 3 at the top, still have 3 down here at the middle, but it's the bottom standoffs which vary slightly. Move over into the case and you can see the 3 pre-installed standoffs at the top are okay, as are the 3 down here in the middle. But at the bottom, there are some more serious changes to be made. So take a look at what needs replacing and take some time to relocate these standoffs to the right location. A standoff tool and all the screws you need come included in the case. Once these have been moved, it's then a good time to pop the motherboard into the chassis. I also appreciate just how many cable ties Fantex include. I'm not sure I'm gonna need that many, but thank you, I suppose. The next part on the list isn't the GPU. Sorry to disappoint. Instead, it's gonna be the power supply. Now, the reason for this is because all the cables and wiring is much easier to do now than it is when the graphics card has already been installed. It just means, especially on these smaller METX boards, these bottom headers are far more clear and easy to access, and that is where MSI's MAG A650BN comes in. I'm always on the hunt when it comes to great value power supplies, and this seems, I think, to tick all the boxes. Now, it's basic. You get the power cable, which was a good start. It looks to be fairly well packaged, again, pretty nice, and it's very, very cheap. That's probably the most important reason it works for this build. 650 watts, though, I think should be enough for our 7800 XT. AMD officially recommends 700 watts. However, the 7600 Ryzen chip is only about 65. So between the two of them, I think we're going to be good to go. Now, it isn't ATX3, so you don't get the fancy new cables, and nor is it modular, meaning you don't get to choose what plugs in. But with it being lower power, it's not like there's multiple GPU harnesses or loads of CPU or loads of SATA power connections, keeping cable management at least that little bit easier. Now, this build, as I say, it does have a special power supply chamber area at the bottom, and when the side panel's on, you can't see in, which helps aesthetically. Technically speaking, if you're worried about room for cable management, we don't actually need the drive bay as there's no hard drive in this build, but I still think there's going to be more than enough space to install everything without too many problems. Power supply wise, I am going to unweave or unravel all of these cables. I'll be installing it today fan down. That's going to pull in air from underneath the system from down here. If you're planning to put this on a thick rug or carpet, fine, but go for a fan up orientation. The air it pulls in will be warmer as it's coming from the general chamber of the case, but at least your power supply's not going to suffocate. Warm air is better than no air at all. As far as what cables are going to be plugged in, it's pretty simple. The CPU power goes up to the top left. The motherboard power, which is obviously the big one, goes to the right hand side, while all the front panel cables, that includes the JFP1, which handily come in a pre-run block, to the bottom right hand side, HD audio, which goes down to the bottom left, as well as our two USB 3s, Type A and Type C, which go to the right hand side of the motherboard. GPU power is going to be comprised of two 8-pins. That can wait for a few moments, or you'll also want to plug in the built-in fan and RGB controller for, of course, the pre-included fans and RGB in the system. They use a SATA power cable, which looks a little something like this. And with all the power sorted out, it is time for the GPU. Now, as I say, I'm hoping this is going to help fill the build out. Loads of airflow to keep it cool. Just really, really like the 7800 XT, and it doesn't get much better. Unless, of course, you buy the more expensive 7900 GRE, but that will be, again, out the budget today. So check out my recent $1,500 and $1,300 builds. Links in the cards now if you'd like to see those. Now, what you always want to do with the GPU is check which of these rear PCI lanes need removing. On some cheaper cases, these will be like snap out and single use, and it's a nightmare. Get it wrong, you're screwed. In here, they are proper PCI lanes. Fantex clearly know how to make a good PC case, and I'm just so impressed with this chassis. You're going to see this on the channel more and more. Fits the bill for an incredibly competitive price. Now, hover this over the PCI slot, and you can see, yep, it's the top two lanes that I need to take out. By the looks of things, these are thumb screws, but they're quite tight. It's usually the way, to be fair, so you will need to take a screwdriver to the end of these to actually get them dislodged. Keep hold of the thumb screws, as these will be actually securing the GPU in once I've removed the PCI lanes. And then the GPU should slide in without any problems, I think. Yes, look at that. Same screws as just mentioned to actually secure this down and make sure it's not going to go anywhere. There's one. And then, of course, the second as well. And the power cable that I pre-prepped earlier can run through this special personal grommet literally designed for, well, basically this graphics card. It is aligned perfectly. That is going to flick in without too many problems. I'm thinking that one on the left-hand side. No, maybe actually. First criticism, Acer, you want the power cable to go in this way so it's easier to unclip, but it's fine. I'm going to live with it. It's okay. I'm not going to complain. That goes in on the right-hand side, and then, of course, the other one goes in on the left-hand side. A couple of cable ties will secure this in place and just pull it taut through, of course, the bottom grommet, and you can see that that's actually going to look pretty clean and tidy. The big test, though, as always, in my building ability comes in whether this thing will actually power on, will the fans and the RGB spin? I guess there's only really one way to find out. That's a good start, but we haven't got any spinning fans just yet. Aha, they're the front fans, so they all run off a single 4-pin PWM fan header, and then I think we'll have an extra 4-pin PWM at the rear. Just need to find, plenty of spare fan headers at the bottom, one of those to run the back fan off. And in theory, yes, look at that. We are well and truly in business. The RGB controller at the back should also allow me, with a bit of luck, to change the modes. Oh yes, this is amazing. Let me tidy this up, sort all the cables out, pop all the panels on, and play with all the various cool RGB RGB modes, and I'll rejoin you in just a second for those all-important gaming benchmarks. Moving through into performance, and it's going to be no surprise to see AMD's awesome 1440p GPU, the 7800 XT, perform well, with the other components in this build helping push the performance along nicely too. Call of Duty's Warzone is the first game on my list to test, here at 1440p high settings with FSR enabled on the quality preset, and the 7800 XT achieved a solid 186 FPS on average. While moving through into Call of Duty's Modern Warfare 3, again at 1440p high with FSR enabled and on the quality preset, delivered a strong 206 frames per second. It's no surprise to see both of these titles perform equally as well, given the fact they use the same game engine in the background. Moving through to Starfield, and we're dialing things up to 10 in a title that at 1440p high is really difficult to run, both due to the fact the game is just generally very demanding and actually quite poorly optimized when it comes to leveraging the hardware available. Here though, the build still did really well, in fact far better than I'd expected, with 92 FPS on average. Starfield seems to be quite comfortable with AMD GPUs and often yields slightly better results than what you'll find on the Nvidia counterpart. Hogwarts Legacy at 1440p was a similarly positive story, 108 FPS on average. Now don't get me wrong, for an FPS title where competitive frame rates are important, you'll want a bit more, but Hogwarts is an RPG game where the quality and fidelity of the graphics are arguably far more important. In games where you do need frame rate though, like Fortnite, which I tested at 1080p competitive settings, the build didn't let me down. 288 FPS on average was mightily impressive, with the Acer GPU in this system performing equally well. Apex Legends at 1440p high is next up. Here the build again performed really well, 228 FPS on average. For a bit of context, the recent test at the same settings with a 4070 Ti Super only yielded 275, so 228 from what is undeniably a much cheaper GPU was very good. Cyberpunk 2077 wraps things up, here at 1440p high with FSR enabled and set to the quality preset. Cyberpunk's a game where you need those DLSS and FSR technologies to help push things forward, and 148 FPS was not disappointing at all. This is a build with plenty of power, and one that offers up extraordinarily good value for money. If you want to pick up any of the parts in this system, I'll leave them linked below for latest pricing and availability. If you'd like to see more from us, make sure to get subscribed. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.